Chapter 4 of Saved at Sea. Chapter 4 Little Timpey. I do not think I have ever seen a prettier face than that child's. She had light brown hair and round rosy cheeks and the bluest of blue eyes. She awoke as we were looking at her, and seeing herself amongst strangers, she cried bitterly. "Poor little thing," said Mrs. Miller, "she wants her mother." "Ma, mamma," cried the little girl, as she caught the word. Mrs. Miller fairly broke down at this, and sobbed and cried as much as the child. "Come, my lass," said her husband, "cheer up. Thee'll make her worse if thee takes on so." But Mrs. Miller could do nothing but cry. "Just think if it was our Polly," was all that she could say. "Oh, Jem, just think if it was our Polly that was calling for me." My grandfather took the child from her and put her on my knee. "Now, Mary," he said, "get us a bit of fire and something to eat, there's a good woman. The child's cold and hungered, and we're much about the same ourselves." Mrs. Miller bustled about the house, and soon lighted a blazing fire. Then she ran in next door to see if her children, whom she had left with a servant girl, were all right, and she brought back with her some cold meat for our breakfast. I sat down on a stool before the fire with the child on my knee. She seemed to be about 2 years old, a strong, healthy little thing. She had stopped crying now, and did not seem to be afraid of me, but whenever any of the others came near she hid her face in my shoulder. Mrs. Miller brought her a basin of bread and milk, and she let me feed her. She seemed very weary and sleepy, as if she could hardly keep her eyes open. "Poor wee lassie," said my grandfather. "I expect they pulled her out of bed to bring her on deck. Won't you put her to bed?" "Yes," said Mrs. Miller, "I'll put her in our Polly's bed. She'll sleep there quite nice, she will." But the child clung to me, and cried so loudly when Mrs. Miller tried to take her, that my grandfather said, "I wouldn't take her away, poor motherless lamb. She takes kindly to Alick, let her bide there." So we made up a little bed for her on the sofa, and Mrs. Miller brought one of little Polly's nightgowns, and undressed and washed her, and put her to bed. The child was still very shy of all of them but me. She seemed to have taken to me from the first, and when she was put into her little bed, she held out her tiny hand to me, and said, "Handy, Timpey's handy." "What does she say, bless her?" said Mrs. Miller, for it was almost the first time that the child had spoken. "She wants me to hold her hand," I said, "Timpey's little hand. Timpey must be her name." "I never heard of such a name," said Mrs. Miller. "Timpey, did you say? What do they call you, darling?" she said to the child. But the little blue eyes were closing wearily, and very soon the child was asleep. I still held that tiny hand in mine as I sat beside her. I was afraid of waking her by putting it down. "I wonder who she is," said Mrs. Miller in a whisper, as she folded up her little clothes. "She has beautiful things on, to be sure. She has been well taken care of, anyhow. Stop! Here's something written on the little petticoat. Can you make it out, Alick?" I laid down the little hand very carefully, and took the tiny petticoat to the window. "Yes," I said, "this will be her name. Here's Villiers written on it." "Dear me," said Mrs. Miller. "Yes, that will be her name. Dear me, dear me! To think of her poor father and mother at the bottom of that dreadful sea. Just think if it was our Polly!" And then Mrs. Miller cried so much again that she was obliged to go home and finish her cry, with her little Polly clasped tightly in her arms. My grandfather was very worn out with all he had done during the night, and went upstairs to bed. I sat watching the little sleeping child. I felt as if I could not leave her. She slept very quietly and peacefully. Poor little pet! How little she knows what has happened, I thought, and my tears came fast, and fell on the little fat hand which was lying on the pillow. But after a few minutes I leaned my head against the sofa and fell fast asleep. I had had no sleep the night before, and was quite worn out. I was awakened some hours after by someone pulling my hair, and a little voice calling in my ear, "Up, up, boy, up, up!" I looked up, and saw a little roughish face looking at me, the merriest, brightest little face you can imagine. "Up, up, boy, please," she said again in a coaxing voice. So I lifted up my head, and she climbed out of her little bed on the sofa to my knee. "Put shoes on, boy," she said, holding out her little bare toes. I put on her shoes and stockings, and then Mrs. Miller came in and dressed her. It was a lovely afternoon. The storm had ceased whilst we had been asleep, and the sun was shining brightly. I got the dinner ready, and the child watched me, and ran backwards and forwards up and down the kitchen. She seemed quite at home now, and very happy. My grandfather was still asleep, so I did not wake him. Mrs. Miller brought in some broth she had made for the child, and we dined together. I wanted to feed her, as I had done the night before, but she said, "Timpey have poon, please," and took the spoon from me, and fed herself so prettily I could not help watching her. "God bless her, the poor little thing," said Mrs. Miller. "God bless oo," said the child. The words were evidently familiar to her. "She must have heard her mother say so," said Mrs. Miller in a choking voice. When we had finished dinner, the child slipped down from her stool and ran to the sofa. Here she found my grandfather's hat, which she put on her head, and my scarf, which she hung round her neck. Then she marched to the door, and said, "Tata, tata, Timpey go tata." "Take her out of bed, Alick," said Mrs. Miller. "Stop a minute, though, I'll fetch her Polly's hood." So, to her great delight, we dressed her in Polly's hood, and put a warm shawl around her, and I took her out. Oh, how she ran and jumped and played in the garden! I never saw such a merry little thing. Now she was picking up stones, now she was gathering daisies, day-days, she called them, now she was running down the path and calling to me to catch her. She was never still a single instant. But every now and then, as I was playing with her, I looked across the sea to Ainsley Crag. The sea had not gone down much, though the wind had ceased, and I saw the waves still dashing wildly upon the rocks. And I thought of what lay beneath them, of the shattered ship, and of the child's mother. Oh, if she only knew, I thought, as I listened to her merry laugh, which made me more ready to cry than her tears had done. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Saved at Sea by Mrs. O.F. Walton. Chapter 5. The Unclaimed Sunbeam. My grandfather and Jem Miller were sitting over the fire in the little watch-room in the lighthouse tower, and I sat beside them with the child on my knee. I had found an old picture book for her, and she was turning over the leaves, and making her funny little remarks on the pictures. "Well, Sandy," said Miller, "what shall we do with her?" "Do with her?" said my grandfather, stroking her little fair head. "We'll keep her, won't we, little lassie?" "Yes," said the child, looking up and nodding her head as if she understood all about it. "We ought to look up some of her relations, it seems to me," said Jem. "She's sure to have some somewhere." "And how are we to find them out?" asked my grandfather. "Oh, the captain can soon make out for us what ship is missing, and we can send a line to the owners. They'll know who the passengers was." "Well," said my grandfather, "maybe you're right, Jem. We'll see what they say. But for my part, if them that cares for the child is at the bottom of the sea, I hope no one else will come and take her away from us." "If I hadn't so many of them at home," began Miller. "Oh, yes, my lad, I know that," said my grandfather, interrupting him, "but thy house is full enough already. Let the wee lassie come to Alick and me. She'll be a nice little bit of company for us, and Mary will see to her clothes and such like, I know." "Yes, that she will," said her husband. "I do declare that she's been crying about that child the best part of the day. She has, indeed." My grandfather followed Jem's advice, and told Captain Sayers, when he came in the steamer the next Monday, the whole story of the shipwreck, and asked him to find out for him the name and address of the owners of the vessel. Oh, how I hoped that no one could come to claim my little darling! She became dearer to me every day, and I felt as if it would break my heart to part with her. Every night when Mrs. Miller had undressed her, she knelt beside me in her little white nightgown to "talk to God," as she called praying. She had evidently learned a little prayer from her mother, for the first night she began of her own accord, "Jesus, Eppy, hear me." I could not think at first what it was that she was saying, but Mrs. Miller said she had learnt the hymn when she was a little girl, and she wrote out the first verse for me. And every night afterwards I let the child repeat it after me. "Jesus, tender shepherd, hear me. Bless thy little lamb to-night. Through the darkness be thou near me. Keep me safe till morning light." I thought I should like her always to say the prayer her mother had taught her. I never prayed myself. My grandfather had never taught me. I wondered if my mother would have taught me if she had lived. I thought she would. I knew very little in those days of the Bible. My grandfather did not care for it, and had never read it. He had a large Bible, but it was always on the top of the chest of drawers, as a kind of ornament, and unless I took it down to look at the curious old pictures inside, it was never opened. Sunday on the island was just the same as any other day. My grandfather worked in the garden, or read the newspaper, just the same as usual, and I rambled about the rocks, or did my lessons, or worked in the house, as I did every other day in the week. We had no church or chapel to go to, and nothing happened to mark the day. I often think now of that dreadful morning when we went across the stormy sea to that sinking ship. If our boat had capsized then, if we had been lost, what would have become of our souls? It is a very solemn thought, and I cannot be too thankful to God for sparing us both a little longer. My grandfather was a kind-hearted, good-tempered, honest old man, but I know that that is not enough to open the door of heaven. Jesus is the only way there, and my grandfather knew little of, and cared nothing for, him. Little Timpey became my constant companion indoors and out of doors. She was rather shy of the little Millers, for they were noisy and rough in their play, but she clung to me, and never wanted to leave me. Day by day she learnt new words, and came out with such little odd remarks of her own, that she made us all laugh. Her great pleasure was to get hold of a book, and pick out the different letters of the alphabet, which, although she could hardly talk, she knew quite perfectly. Dear little pet, I can see her now, sitting at my feet on a large rock by the seashore, and calling me every minute to look at A, or B, or D, or S. And so, by her pretty ways, she crept into all our hearts, and we quite dreaded the answer coming to the letter my grandfather had written to the owners of the Victory, which, we found, was the name of the lost ship. It was a very wet day, the Monday that answer came. I had been waiting some time on the pier, and was wet through before the steamer arrived. Captain Sayers handed me the letter before anything else, and I ran up with it to my grandfather at once. I could not wait until our provisions and supplies were brought on shore. Little Timpey was sitting on a stool at my grandfather's feet, winding a long piece of tape round and round her little finger. She ran to meet me as I came in, and held up her face to be kissed. What if this letter should say that she was to leave us and go back by the steamer? I drew a long breath as my grandfather opened it. It was a very civil letter from the owners of the ship, thanking us for all we had done to save the unhappy crew and passengers, but saying they knew nothing of the child or her belongings, as no one in the name of Villiers had taken a cabin, and there was no sailor on board of that name. But they said they would make further inquiries in Calcutta, from which the port the vessel had sailed. Meanwhile they begged my grandfather to take charge of the child, and assured him that he should be handsomely rewarded for his trouble. "That's right," I said, when he had finished reading it. "Then she hasn't to go yet." "No," said my grandfather. "Poor wee lassie, we can't spare her yet. I don't want any of their rewards, Alick, not I. That's reward enough for me," he said, as he lifted up the child to kiss his wrinkled forehead. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Saved at Sea, by Mrs. O. F. Walton. Chapter 6, The Old Gentleman's Question. The next Monday morning Timpey and I went down together to the pier to await the arrival of the steamer. She had brought a doll with her, which Mrs. Miller had given her, and of which she was very proud. Captain Sayers sent for me, as soon as the steamer came up to the pier, to tell me that 2 gentlemen had come to see my grandfather. I held the child's hand very tightly in mine, for I had felt sure they had come for her. The gentlemen came up the steps a minute or 2 afterwards. One of them was a middle-aged man with a very clever face, I thought. He told me that he had come to see Mr. Alexander Fergusson, and asked me if I could direct him which way to go to the house. "Yes, sir," I said, "Mr. Fergusson is my grandfather." So we went up towards the lighthouse, Timpey and I walking first to lead the way, and the gentleman following. The other gentleman was quite old, and had white hair and gold spectacles, and a pleasant, kindly face. Timpey could not walk very fast, and she kept running first to one side and then to another, to gather flowers or pick up stones. So I took her in my arms and carried her. "Is that your little sister?" asked the old gentleman. "No, sir," I said. "This is the little girl who was on board the Victory." Dear me," said both gentlemen at once. "Let me look at her," said the old man, arranging his spectacles. But Timpey was frightened and clung to me and began to cry. Never mind," said the old gentleman kindly. "We'll make friends with one another by and by." By this time we had reached the house, and the middle-aged gentleman introduced himself as Mr. Septimus Forster, one of the owners of the lost vessel, and said that he and his father-in-law, Mr. Davis, had come to hear all particulars that my grandfather could give them with regard to the shipwreck. My grandfather begged them to sit down, and told me to prepare breakfast for them at once. They were very pleasant gentlemen, both of them, and were very kind to my grandfather. Mr. Forster wanted to make him a handsome present for what he had done, but my grandfather would not take it. They talked much of little Timpey, and I kept stopping to listen as I was setting out the cups and saucers. They had heard nothing more of her relations, and they said it was a very strange thing that no such name as Villiers was to be found on the list of passengers on board. They offered to take her away with them till some relation was found, but my grandfather begged to keep her. The gentleman, seeing how happy and well cared for the child was, gladly consented. After breakfast Mr. Forster said he should like to see the lighthouse, so my grandfather went up to the top of the tower with him, and showed him with great pride all that was to be seen there. Old Mr. Davis was tired and stayed behind with little Timpey and me. "This is a strong house, my lad," he said, when the others had gone. "Yes, sir," I said, "it ought to be strong. The wind is fearful here sometimes." "What sort of a foundation has it?" said the old man, tapping the floor with his stick. "Oh, it's all rock, sir," I answered. "Solid rock. Our house and the lighthouse tower are all built into the rock. They would never stand if they weren't." "And are you on the rock, my lad?" said Mr. Davis, looking at me through his spectacles. "I beg your pardon, sir," I said, for I thought I had not heard him rightly. "Are you on the rock?" he repeated. "On the rock, sir? Oh, yes," I said, thinking he could not have understood what I said before. "All these buildings are built into the rock, or the wind and sea would carry them away." "But you," said the old gentleman again, "are you on the rock?" "I don't quite understand you, sir," I said. "Never mind," said he. "I'll ask your grandfather when he comes down." So I sat still, wondering what he could mean, and almost thinking he must have gone out of his mind. As soon as my grandfather returned, he put the same question to him, and my grandfather answered it as I had done, by assuring him how firmly and strongly the lighthouse and its surroundings were built into the solid rock. "And you yourself," said Mr. Davis, "how long have you been on the rock?" "I, sir," said my grandfather, "I suppose you mean how long I have lived here. 46 years, sir. 40 years come the 12th of next month I've lived on this rock." "And how much longer do you expect to live here?" said the old gentleman. "Oh, I don't know, sir," said my grandfather. "As long as I live, I suppose. Alick here will take my place by and by. He's a fine strong boy, is Alick, sir." "And where will you live when you leave the island?" asked Mr. Davis. "Oh, I never mean to leave it," said my grandfather. "Not till I die, sir." "And then, where will you live then?" "Oh, I don't know, sir," said my grandfather. "In heaven, I suppose. But dear me, I'm not going there just yet," he said, as if he did not like the turn the conversation was taking. "Would you mind answering me one more question?" said old Mr. Davis. "Would you kindly tell me why you think you'll go to heaven? You won't mind my asking you, will you?" "Oh dear, no," said my grandfather. "Not at all, sir. Well, sir, you see I've never done anybody harm, and God is very merciful, and so I've no doubt it will be all right at last." "Why, my dear friend," said the old gentleman, "I thought you said you were on the rock. You're not on the rock at all, you're on the sand." He was going to add more, when one of Captain Sayers' men ran up to say the steamer was ready to start, and they would kindly come at once, as it was late already. So the two gentlemen jumped up and prepared hastily to go down to the beach. But as old Mr. Davis took leave of my grandfather, he said earnestly, "My friend, you are building on the sand, you are indeed, and it won't stand the storm. No, it won't stand the storm." He had no time to say more. The sailor hastened him away. I followed them down to the pier, and stood there watching the steamer preparing to start. There was a little delay after the gentlemen went on board, and I saw Mr. Davis sit down on a seat on deck, take out his pocket-book, and write something on one of the leaves. Then he tore the leaf out, and gave it to one of the sailors to hand to me as I stood on the pier. And in another moment the steamer had started. End of chapter 6.